Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 70 of Contemplating Life. This week we return to my reminiscence of my college days at IUPUI studying computer science. It's been a couple of episodes since we talked about this, so I'll briefly recap. Back in episode 64, I recounted stories surrounding my sixth semester at IUPUI, which was one of the toughest ones I had. I got lost in quantum mechanics and had to drop a physics class. I barely passed an advanced calculus class with a D. I struggled to complete all the programs required for Programming 3 under Dr. John Gersting. Finally, I did a significantly substandard job in a one-on-one independent study project with Dr. G. I recounted that I got off to a rocky start with his wife, Mrs. Dr. Judith Gersting. But once we got going, I had a great time in her very challenging class in my 7th semester. I bounced back from that bad semester, earning an A in her class. It was called Discrete Computer Structures CS482. It was followed up with a companion class, CS484, Computability Theory, the following semester with Mrs. Dr. G, and that was also quite challenging. I earned a B in her follow-up class. I can't recall which lessons were in which semester. They all kind of blur together after nearly 50 years. I should mention that for some time it was obvious I wasn't going to be able to finish in 4 years. It was going to take at least one additional semester to get all my requirements. I spoke with the people at the Indiana Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, and they agreed they could continue to fund me for 9 semesters. My 7th semester transcript from the fall of 1976 shows that I also took a class called Arch of Computers CS402. Presumably Arch was abbreviation for architecture. It was about the inner workings of computer hardware. When I saw that on my transcript, I initially had little or no recollection of that class. I thought everything I learned about computer hardware was in my first programming class with Dr. Larry Hunter. I told you about jokes that I wrote for him to use in class. But now that I think about it more, there was a good chance those computer hardware jokes I wrote for Dr. Hunter were actually in this CS402 class. Now keep in mind, we're talking about events 45 years ago, so my memory is not very good. The transcript shows I earned a B. This explains a mystery that arose when discussing my college days with my friend Rich. Rich remembers that Dr. Hunter planned his lessons so well that everything he had to write on the blackboard would exactly fit in the amount of space available. The blackboard spanned the entire front wall of the classrooms, perhaps 20 to 25 feet wide. One day we came into class, and someone had written something on the lower right of the blackboard in an area about 3 by 3 feet. They drew a box around it and wrote, "Do not erase." Hunter was quite frustrated. When he got to the end of the lesson and needed that extra space, he went back to the upper left side of the blackboard, erased an area of his own work, exactly the size of the do not erase area that was in the lower right of the blackboard. He continued writing his notes for the lesson, and they exactly filled that space. Rich reminded me of that story, and he thought it was Dr. Hunter, and I recalled it was as well. However, I know for certain that Rich and I did not take CS220 together, because that was my first year, and Rich wasn't at IUPUI until the following year. So the whole thing really took place in my CS402 class, Computer Architecture, including the jokes that I wrote for Dr. Hunter. Moving along, the transcript also shows a class called Numerical Methods CS114. Now, there's some mathematical equations that you cannot solve directly, but by using computers, you can approximate the answer. then figure out how big your error is, and make another guesstimate that is closer. Now, there are slow ways to do that and get your answer eventually, but this class was about advanced ways of solving such equations more efficiently. I really enjoyed the course. I remember the guy who taught it, but I can't remember his name. This course would prove somewhat useful to me in later years when I worked on an open-source graphics rendering program called the Persistence of Vision Ray Tracer, or IUPUI for short. Some of the calculations in ray tracing involve solving higher-order polynomial equations using numerical methods. Now, I wasn't able to apply any of the lessons I learned in that numerical methods class to improve the calculations in IUPUI, but it did help me understand how the rendering program used these methods in solving its equations. There were other lessons I learned later in college that I was able to apply to the ray tracing program, and I'll talk about that in a later episode. The remaining class I took that semester was Oscillations and Waves, Physics 322. I don't remember a lot about the class, but I remember one particularly enjoyable lab experiment we did using a spectrometer. We think of ordinary light as being white, but in fact it's made up of many different colors of light that can be seen when passing the light through a prism or an etched piece of glass known as a diffraction grating. Light consists of electromagnetic waves, and the frequency of that wave is perceived by us as its color. A spectrometer splits the light into its component frequencies. Astronomers use spectrography to study what elements are in distant stars and galaxies. Different chemical elements create distinct bands in a spectrograph as the atoms are excited and emit light at specific frequencies. Also, light passing through these elements is absorbed in particular bands, which appear as dark lines in a spectrograph. For example, the new James Webb Space Telescope looks at starlight as it passes through the atmospheres of extrasolar planets to see what chemicals are in the atmosphere of those planets. Scientists hope to use this information to detect the telltale signs of life on these planets by understanding what chemicals are in the atmosphere. For this lab experiment, we had a collection of gas-filled tubes about 8 inches long and a half-inch in diameter. They looked like small neon tubes, and in fact, one of them did contain neon. You would place them in a socket that would electrically charge them, and they would glow in various colors. We would then pass that light through a small slit and then onto a diffraction grating. This would split the light into a rainbow of narrow bands. We would measure how much each band was deflected. There was a very long calculation you would use to compute the deflection angle, and that would tell you the frequency of each color band. We would then look that up in a table of the frequency bands for known substances, and that way we could identify what kind of gas was in the tube. The calculation took about 30 steps on a scientific pocket calculator. I had recently purchased a Hewlett-Packard HP21 calculator, using the money I made by ghostwriting programs for another student who could not complete her assignments by the end of the semester. One of my classmates, a physics major named John, had the more sophisticated HP25C programmable calculator. You could program in the formula, enter 1 or 2 raw numbers, hit the run button, and a few seconds later, you had your answer without manually punching in about 30 steps to do the calculations. I turned to John, who was at the next table over. I said, "Hey, I bet you're enjoying that new programmable calculator. That makes these calculations a breeze." John says, "Well, I haven't learned how to use the programmability feature yet. I'm just using it as an ordinary calculator." I was shocked. I said, "Well, then trade me calculators for a few minutes. Use my HP 21, and I'll program your 25. He agreed. Without ever reading a manual on how to program it, I figured it out, programmed in the calculations, put a couple of constant values into two of its registers, entered the raw numbers from each of my observations, hit run, and out came my answer. My lab partner and I finished the entire process in about half the time of anyone else in the room. I thought about deleting the program before swapping calculators back with John, but instead I was gracious and I showed him how to run the program so he can complete the rest of his calculations quickly. This caused me to conclude there ought to be a worthiness test before you can buy certain electronic gadgets. People who don't know how to use an advanced calculator ought not to be able to purchase one unless they know what it can do for them. I feel the same way sometimes about personal computers, 3D printers, cable TV boxes, and smart TVs. I guess I just get jealous when people have better equipment than I can afford, but they don't know how to make full use of it. It seems a waste. The other situation that freaks me out is when someone buys a new high-tech toy like a computer or a laptop, and they don't even bother to take it out of the box for several days. They ought to put a timer in such boxes that if you don't open them and set them up within 24 hours, they self-destruct like a Mission Impossible tape recording. Anyway, overall, the 7th semester was a good one. I ended up with 4 B's and an A. Several times over this podcast, I've confessed to some pretty bad attitudes I've had, and some not-so-noble behavior. And now we come to another such story. There were 2 different computer departments at IUPUI. I was in computer science, designated by the letters CS or sometimes CSCI. It was offered by the School of Science. But there was also a School of Technology program that offered computer technology. They abbreviated that CPT. Some of the computer science majors tended to look down on the computer technology majors. We were pretty arrogant, or at least I was, and I know there were many others, if not everyone in CS. Our programming classes were heavily geared towards science, engineering, mathematics, and computer theory. We also concentrated on what's called systems programming. We learned how to write compilers, assemblers, and an operating system. It's the computer science people who wrote Windows, and they wrote programs that made it possible to write Windows. Computer science people also write application programs, such as word processors, spreadsheets, and database managers. The computer technology classes were focused heavily on business applications, written in languages like COBOL and PL1. COBOL is an acronym for Common Business-Oriented Language. It handles the grunt work of taking data in, which is formatted in a particular way, and producing reports formatted in a particular way. About 80% or more of a COBOL program is just getting the data in and getting the results back out, and only about 20% or less is devoted to the actual calculations. PL1 was a programming language invented by IBM, designed to combine both business and scientific applications in one language. But in the end, it was sort of a bastard child that was not well accepted by either group. The scientific programmers thought it looked too much like COBOL, and the business programmers thought it looked too much like Fortran or Algol. It was also supposed to be good for systems programming, such as operating systems and compilers, but even IBM had to invent a modified version of the language called PLS for systems programming, because PL1 wouldn't do it. I mentioned previously that one of my classmates had to drop out of school to take a job because his family needed the money. He was going to write COBOL for an insurance company, and that was considered sort of a bottom-of-the-barrel, low-level job for a big bad computer science major. It was the kind of job that computer technology people took. Many of the computer science people felt such work was beneath us. Now, my buddy Frank was in CPT rather than CS, and I often wondered why he took what I thought was the lesser road. But the truth was, CPT students were just as smart as CS students. It was just that there was this rivalry born out of arrogance. They probably thought us to be a bunch of elitists and snobs, which we were. I'm not at all proud of that condescending attitude, and I don't mean to say that everyone in computer science felt that way, but I'm confident that many did. It wasn't just academic arrogance on my part. I just thought that systems programming, as well as scientific and engineering programming, would be much more interesting than business-oriented programming. And I thought there were good opportunities for me in that field. There's a facility on the east side of Indianapolis called Naval Avionics. They make weapons systems for the U.S. military, and would likely hire someone like me with a computer science degree and a second major in physics. I also might be destined for a job with a pharmaceutical company like Eli Lilly, although I had no experience in chemistry, so that might have been a problem. Of course, at the time, no one knew how big personal computers would be, and that PC software would be my primary focus. Although we studied business programming languages like COBOL and PL1 in Dr. John Gersting's Bible study class, remember we referred to his textbook as the Bible, we only spent a couple of weeks on each of those languages. I felt the amount of time we devoted to them was indicative of what their perceived value was to us. I remember we had a humorous poem we passed around that was the ABCs of computer science. I only remember a couple of the verses. One of them was, C is for COBOL. Oh, what a pity. It was designed by a committee. The other one I recall was, L is for languages. Use these three. Fortran, Pascal, and RPG. Avoid all others, and my friends shun those with the suffix L/1. Even though I looked down on business-related programming in the entire CPT department, I thought I needed a fallback plan in case I couldn't get a scientific or engineering programming job. So for my 8th semester, I took 2 courses in computer technology. One of them was the dreaded COBOL, a course called CPT 265, and the other one was the only slightly less dreaded PL1, CPT 360. I found them very boring, and I never had any use for anything I learned in either of those classes. I got a B in the PL1 class, but much to my shock, my transcript says I withdrew from the COBOL class. I didn't remember doing that, but it explains why I don't remember much about the class if I quit partway through. I had thought that the physics class I dropped was the only one I ever quit. My 8th and 9th semesters, I began taking graduate level courses. These courses are numbered in the 500 to 600 range. Some people warned me, But don't do that. If you come back for your master's or your PhD, you won't have enough classes available. You will have already taken everything they have to offer. As I mentioned previously, the computer science department was brand new, and the curriculum was not very extensive. They only offered a minimal number of courses to complete the degree. My reply was, hey, I'm not in this for academic glory. For me, this is just job training. I could have gone to a technical school to learn programming, or I could have gotten a CPT degree. But I figure that given my disability, I need every advantage I can get. I want, and I think I need, the prestige of that Bachelor of Science degree. But once I get that, I'm headed straight for the workforce and never going back. And once I did get my BS, I never did go back. Although in recent years, I kind of wondered what it'd be like to go get a master's or a PhD just for the fun of it. Anyway, in my 8th semester, in addition to the 2 CPT classes I took CS502, Compile and Probe Systems, which I don't know exactly what that involved. The title's so abbreviated in the transcript, I can't make much sense of it. I also took that 2nd semester the computability theory class with Mrs. Dr. G. My final class in my 8th semester was Statistics 511. It covered both probability and statistics, which I thought I might need someday for computer simulations and for data analysis. It was taught by a graduate student or teaching assistant who lived in Bloomington. He would only commute to Indianapolis to teach the class 2 evenings per week. Note that a semester is 15 weeks long. About the 2nd week, he asked if the class would agree to meet for a double class only once a week. We all agreed. Now, we had some nasty weather that winter, and on at least 2 occasions, he canceled class because he couldn't make it up from Bloomington. I don't remember if those cancellations were single or double classes. I'm pretty sure one of them was a double class. On the evenings when he did manage to show up, he generally only kept us for about a class and a half instead of 2 full periods. My guess is that we ended up with barely 50% of the amount of class time we should have had. I would also guess we were lucky if we covered a third of the material in the course. We didn't get around to the midterm exam until about 2/3 of the way through the class, and I don't think he ever did give us a final exam. He just used our midterm grade as our final grade. Most of what we covered was probability, and we didn't get very far into statistics. Being a lifelong poker player, I already knew a lot about probability. For me, it was an easy A. It's a good thing I never needed anything that was supposed to be taught in the class. The biggest thing that happened in my 8th semester was that I started applying for legitimate jobs as a programmer. We'll talk about that experience in the next episode, wherein my mentor, Dr. John Gersting, plays a key role. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 a month. You get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although my finances are a mess, I'm not in this for the money, but every little bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to all of my financial supporters. That means more to me than words can express. Even if you cannot provide financial support, please share this on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to be able to hear my stories. All my back episodes are available, so go check those out. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, let me know, and I'll try to address them. I'll see you next time, as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.